Today we are looking at section 4.7. Our objective today is I can solve polynomial equations. Now a polynomial equation is an equation of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Notice that your polynomial is on the left hand side and it's always set equal to 0 if you want to solve it. Okay? In order to solve polynomial equations, we use what's called the zero product property, which is just a fancy name for saying anything times 0 equals 0. Okay? So our goal is to factor the polynomial just like we factored in the last couple days, and then set each factor equal to 0 and force it to be 0. So for instance, if I have x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0, then what I would want to do is I would want to factor that. So it's 3 terms, there's no common factors. So that means I'm going to do the negative, or do the x, so I'm going to put negative 6 and 1. So what multiplies to negative 6 but adds up to a positive 1 is a positive 3 and a negative 2. Now there's no leading coefficient, so I go straight to our binomials. Okay, now remember, if something's in parentheses, we treat it like it's a number. So if we can make this number equal 0, then the whole thing will equal 0. Or if we can make this one equal 0, then the whole thing will equal 0. So what we do is we force it to be 0. So we say, okay, x plus 3 has to be 0, or x minus 2 has to be 0. Solve for x. We get x equals negative 3, or x equals 2. So the two values of x that will make the equation equal to 0 are negative 3 or negative 2. So for example, if I put negative 3 in for x, negative 3 plus 3 is 0. 0 times negative 5 is 0, so 0 equals 0. It checks. Right? If I put a 2 in for x, I get 2 plus 3 times 2 minus 2. So 5 times 0, 0 equals 0. It checks. So the two values of x that will make the equation equal to 0 are negative 3 and 2. So I like to put my answers in solution set. So the solution to that equation is negative 3 and 2. Right? So notice that when I solved this, it was set equal to 0. So here are the steps that you always want to follow when you're going to solve a polynomial equation. Step number 1, set equal to 0. Step number 2 is to factor. That was the second thing I did. And step number 3, set each factor equal 0. Okay, so that's basically the process that I did for that first example. So let's look at the next example, example 2. So I have y squared plus 7y equals 18. Step number 1, make sure it's set equal to 0. So in order to set equal to 0, I have to subtract 18 from both sides. So I get y squared plus 7y minus 18 equals 0. Step 1 is done. Step 2 is to factor. There's no common factors in the terms. There are 3 terms, so that tells me I'm going to go to the x. So I asked myself, what times what is negative 18 but adds up to a positive 7? Well, it's going to be a 9 and a negative 2. Because 9 times negative 2 is negative 18. 9 plus negative 2 is a positive 7. Now, since there was no leading coefficient, I go straight to my binomial. Okay, so now I have factored it. Step 2 is done. Step 3, set each factor equal to 0 and solve for the variable. So subtract 9. So y equals negative 9. Add 2. Y equals 2. So the two values of y that will make the equation equal 0 are negative 9 and 2. Those are the solutions to that equation. Next example. I have 3r squared equals 10r plus 8. So again, I need it set equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 10r from both sides. And I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. So I have 3r squared minus 10r minus 8 equals 0. Then step number 2 is to factor. There's no common factors, but in this case I have a leading coefficient. So I have to multiply that times the constant. But I have 3 terms, so I'm going to do my x. So 3 times negative 8 is negative 24 and negative 10. So what times what is negative 24 but adds up to negative 10? Well, this is the hard part to figure out, but you just play with the factors until you get negative 12 and 2. And so then, because I had this leading coefficient, remember I have to factor by grouping. So I replace the negative 10r with what it came from. Then I factor by grouping. Okay, in the first group the common factor is 3r. In the second group the common factor is 2. Then the common factor is r minus 4. And what's left over is 3r plus 2. Now it's completely factored. Now set each factor equal to 0. Solve for r. So I'm going to add 4. Here I'm going to subtract 2 and divide by 3. Oops. It's just by 3, not negative 3. So I get negative 2/3. So the two values of r that will make the equation equal to 0 is negative 2/3 and 4. Okay. Next example. Here I have 2c minus 1 times c plus 4 quantity squared equals 0. Well, this is almost completely factored, but this really means c plus 4 times c plus 4. So now it's factored, and it's set equal to 0. Set each factor equal to 0. Solve for c, so add 1. Get 2c equals 1. Divide by 2. c equals 1/2. Subtract 4. Subtract 4. Now notice I got negative 4 twice. That's what we call a double root. So we would say the solutions are 1/2 and negative 4, and you write dr, indicating that negative 4 happens twice, or it's a double root. Okay, next example. Here I have 2q squared plus 6q equals 0. Step number 1, is it set equal to 0? Yes. Step number 2, factor. There's a common factor of 2q. Then I can't factor any further, so then I take each factor and set it equal to 0. Divide both sides by 2 here. Q equals 0. Subtract 3. Q equals negative 3. So my solutions are 0 and negative 3. Okay, one last one. Example. I have 2t squared plus 2t minus 24 equals 0. And this is a t. Okay. Remember, step number 1 is to set each factor equal to 0. Step number 1 is set the equation equal to 0. Step number 2 is to factor. Notice that there's a common factor of 2, so we're going to factor that out. Then we have a trinomial. So what multiplies to negative 12 but adds up to 1? 4 and negative 3. So this is going to be t plus 4, t minus 3. Then set each factor equal to 0. Well, 2 is a factor, but will 2 equal 0? No. So I have to force either this one or this one to be 0 in order to make the whole thing 0. So I set those equal to 0. T equals negative 4. T equals 3. So our solutions are negative 4 and 3. Oh, I'm sorry, I said that was the last example, but I want to do one more because I want to show you when there's this situation. Okay, it's already set equals 0, but in this case, notice that there's a common factor of 2t now. So factor that out, so we get t squared plus 7t plus 6. Okay, then what multiplies to 6 but adds up to 7? 6 and 1. So it's going to be t plus 6, t plus 1. Notice now that I set 2t equals 0. And now, because there's a variable with the 2, now we actually get 3 different answers. So if I divide both sides by 2, I get t equals 0. Subtract 6 here. And here, subtract 1. So here, there are actually 3 values that will make the equation equal 0. 0, negative 6, and negative 1.